Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Allison Bronson. I'm a researcher and an instructor at Humboldt State University in Northern California. And I'm also a former PhD student at the American Museum of Natural History's Richard Gilder Graduate School. So thank you so much for joining us today. I study the anatomy and evolution of both living and fossil fishes. Most of what I work on is fossil cartilage. I do this by using CT scanning, and that uses X-rays to show the inside of fossils in 3D without cutting into them and damaging them. So by learning about the anatomy of fossils, I can figure out how different fishes are related to each other, how different groups of fishes are related to each other, and then that tells me a little bit about how specialized features of sharks evolved. So today we're going to take a tour through the museum's Hall of Vertebrate Origins. And if you have any questions as you're watching, you can post them in the chat and I'll answer them on screen. Okay. So here we go. We're walking from where the titanosaur is into the Hall of Vertebrate Origins. And we're going to pause here for a moment on this first little post that talks about jaws. I see you already have questions in the chat. Just for a moment, all of these little stations in these halls mark specific features that characterize stuff in that hall from that point forward. So this marks the origin of jaws. And jaws are good for feeding, but also for manipulating your environment. So this enabled fishes to pick stuff up and move things around, not just for additional feeding. I see there's a question in the chat from Betty. Betty wants to know how the transition from breathing in water and breathing in air to breathing in air occurred, and how long did it take? And so that's an interesting question. And admittedly, I'm a fish person, not an amphibian person, so I only know a little bit about that. But over a few million years, the origin of amphibians led to gills basically being lost partway through a life cycle. So a kind of good analogous structure is if you look at what happens in salamanders today, you can have a transition from breathing in water to land really quickly, like in a matter of months, but evolutionarily we're talking about millions of years. Betty, I might come back to your question because I do want to talk about Dunkleosteus, which is my favorite placoderm. So you just saw up on the ceiling Dunkleosteus, which is potentially 20 feet long. And those are estimates made from its armor. Okay, and so the front end of Dunkleosteus was covered in very, very heavy dermal bone. It's actually like a couple inches thick, but we'll see, there's the bone of it. It's kind of pectoral girdle, its pectoral fins and their supports were really bony, and its cranium is really bony. And so Dunkleosteus was around up until about 350 million years ago. And its relatives are all of these placoderms here, which are the earliest animals with jaws. That's, I think, Titanichthys there. And so this group that have these heavy, heavy bones at the front of their body and then not much armor behind, we're grouped into a couple of different primary groups. And this first one we're looking at here is the arthrodire placoderms. And this is the biggest placoderm group. So they're characterized by a couple of features. So this mentions here having two tooth plates in the upper jaw that had these sharp cutting edges, but they also had a much more movable head than some other placoderm groups, like the Aniarchs and the Rhinaniforms. So these were kind of like the white sharks of their time is a way to think about them. These were the largest predators and the largest filter feeders as well in the Devonian. Here we have a little panel on what we can see in a fossil, and just emphasizing that the heavy armor of these placoderms is part of why they're so well preserved. They fossilized well. And then these guys, the rhinanids, you'll see that they look a lot like the rays and skates that are around today. But that's complete convergent evolution. They're not closely related. They became flat by doing their own thing. Just the same selective pressures led to a similar shape. So here we're showing a phylogeny of the placoderms, where they kind of are related to other gnathostomes, jawed vertebrates, so that's us. And a little bit here about their dermal armor, their skin armor. And so here we've got some of that armor preserved. You're able to see a little bit of the ornamentation in it. It's hard to see through the glass when you're not actually there. But some of the, as you kind of saw on that Renanid, the flat one, some of them had really beautiful ornamentation on that dermal bone. So we're walking over to my very favorite part of the hall, which is the chondrichthyeans, and those are some reconstructed jaws of Otodus megalodon. And Megalodon honestly kind of moves around in its taxonomy from time to time. So right now I think it's closest to the genus Otodus. So Carcharodon is one of the older names for Megalodon, and it is updated all the time. So we can't fix a museum panel to have a new name like every 2 years. So I'll briefly mention, Paul had a question in the chat about placoderms, and they went extinct at the end of the Devonian in this mass extinction called the Hagenberg event. And the causes for that event are not 100% clear. A paper recently came out that hypothesized volcanic activity and mercury emissions may have had something to do with it. That was like maybe a month ago that paper came out. But people have really gone back and forth about it over time because this was a global extinction of both freshwater and marine animals. Sorry to have kind of gone past Megalodon for a moment. Here we're looking at Cladosellici. And this is an early chondrichthyan in a group called the Samoriforms. And Cladosellici is cool because most of the fossils in that group are fairly well preserved. And if we look here, this is another Samoriform shark that's been really well preserved. Usually cartilage doesn't fossilize very well. So in this fossil, even the claspers are preserved. This is a panel about those. That shows you whether a shark is male or female. If there are claspers on their pelvic fins, it's a male. And if they're absent, we assume the fossil is a female. Like I said, it's rare for cartilage to be preserved. You have to have generally conditions that are kind of acidic or low oxygen that prevent decay from happening before stuff fossilizes. And oh, this is a better segue than I thought, but over here is a little kind of alcove that talks about that cartilage. And this is really what I spend most of my research thinking about. And so the cartilage in these fossils, like I said, requires specific conditions to fossilize, but it tells us a lot about how sharks are related to each other across very long time periods. Now, the teeth can help you figure out a lot about kind of recent relationships, how different species are related within a family, or how different families are related to each other. But for the deeper stuff, we look at the skeletal structure. And so this is part of the skeleton of Orthocanthus, which is one of my favorite Permian fossils. It actually hangs from the ceiling in this hall. And it had a really extra heavy mineralization. Okay, so this tour kind of breezes right past the holocephalan fossils. These are the ratfish, and there's an example of just one of them there. And it kind of walked past the helicoprion fossil, which is probably the most famous holocephalan because it had that cool buzzsaw. But know that ratfishes are also cartilaginous and that they were crazy diverse in the fossil record. Lots and lots of ratfish. This is Hybotis, who has this adorable little crown of spikes. And actually Hybotis, which was common in the Jurassic, is one of the earliest, I would say, very shark-like looking sharks. I mean, it looks kind of like a modern shark with points on its head. And so really around the Triassic and Jurassic, we started to see the origin of a lot of the shark groups that are alive today. Okay, we're getting over here to our close relatives, the Sarcopterygians. These are the coelacanths and lungfishes around today. There are some extinct groups of Sarcopterygians as well. But for example, this is the coelacanth group here, and coelacanths are around today, but we didn't know that until about 1938. So there are fossils of coelacanths up into the late Cretaceous, and then there was a huge gap. We didn't find any more fossils of them, and so we assumed that coelacanths were extinct. And then in 1938, the curator, Marjorie Courtney Latimer, was working in South Africa and found one in a fisherman's catch, and obviously was amazed and sent photos of that specimen and confirmed that it was a living coelacanth. So here are some lungfishes, and there are just basically 3 lungfish around today, but their fossil record is incredibly diverse, particularly in the Cretaceous. And they are so named because they have a lung, an outpocketing of their gut that's used to hold air. So this is a little important alcove here, talking about why these Sarcopterygians are called lobe-finned fishes. And that's because they have one bone, just like our humerus, that connects to their shoulder girdle, to their pelvic or their pectoral girdle. And so the pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle of these fishes, just like in our limbs, have a single bone that attaches to them. And then, of course, in a fish, that becomes a fin at the end. In the tetrapods, that becomes a limb. This is Zophanctinus, who honestly, Zophanctinus always looks like he's having a bad day. He always looks grumpy. But Zophanctinus is just this massive, massive fish, between 15 and 20 feet long, that lived primarily in the late Cretaceous. And so this is an example of a teleost fish. Teleosts are by far the most diverse group of vertebrates alive today. So this panel that was made a while ago says 23,000 living species of ray fin fishes. To give you an idea of how quickly that changes, there are, I think, over 300 species of fish described last year. There are now 35,000 species of fishes. Okay, so we update that all the time. And the reason teleosts are so diverse is because their skeleton enables them to feed in a lot of diverse ways. So they have a very mobile bone called a premaxilla that allows their jaws to kind of move forward and narrow the gape of their mouth, and that helps them feed. Okay, so big transition here in the hall. We are about to look at things that have 4 limbs. And so 4 feet tetrapods, that's our group. We are the tetrapods. And so Neil Shubin at the University of Chicago calls this the 1 blob, 2 blob, lots of blobs model. So you have a humerus or a femur, and then 2 bones coming off of that, and then lots of blobs at the end. And so everyone in the tetrapod group has that basic structure. It'll just be modified in different ways. So we're going to see a couple of those modifications as we're walking around the hall together. This little panel here talks briefly about the evolution of limbs. And limbs actually originated in aquatic animals. So there were limb structures before things were actually walking around on land. Potentially they were using them to kind of crawl over debris in the water to propel themselves forward to catch their food. But of course, these have diversified in just remarkable ways, whether it's the running stance of theropod dinosaurs or cervids like deer, or the kind of squat stance that you see in other archosaurs like crocodiles. Yeah, they've just done a lot. Okay, so this little guy is Butneria, and this is actually, it's kind of in the middle of the hall, and people often kind of pass by it, but this is really cool because this is a composite of multiple specimens. I think it'll show the panel in a second. Yeah, so it's really rare to have beautiful 3-dimensional fossils of this species. And so this is kind of a composite of multiple specimens but it's real. So when you walk past this, the next time you visit the museum, it's not a cast, that is a real Benaria. It's kind of cool to see that very early extinct amphibian. So the temnospondylus and lepospondylus, these are some extinct and some living frogs, salamanders, and their relatives. And amphibians, you can think of their life cycle as being a little bit intermediate between aquatic and terrestrial. Oh, that's Diplocaulus there. Look at that ridiculous skull. It sticks way out to the side. And so something really neat about a couple of the displays in this part of the hall is that we have growth series like that for some types of amphibians. And for Diplocaulus as well, you can kind of see it looking forward right now. See how its head became more boomerang-like as it aged? So we're going to look at a couple of other amphibians here, including at the bottom, there are some living taxa and their skeletons. That's Ariops there, who's kind of like a frog plus a salamander, really heavy bones for an amphibian. And over here is one of my favorite things in this entire hall. So this is Macedonsaurus, and if you look at the end of his nose, you can see two little tusks sticking up at the end of the snout through holes in the end of the snout. And I just think that's completely bizarre and wonderful. It's a relative of living frogs. Okay, so we're walking over kind of towards the middle of the hall, and that's the library back there. So I mentioned that amphibians are sort of in between life in water and life on land. And this transition is what distinguishes the full transition to life on land. That's because amniotes, which are the reptiles, the mammals, and the birds, okay, they have a watertight egg. So we're amniotes too, okay? We have an amnion that is part of our placenta structure, okay? But the watertight egg means that amniotes do not rely on being near water to spawn. Brennan wants to know in the chat, what were the tusks for on Macedonsaurus? Brennan, I do not know. There may be some fossil amphibian experts that have figured this out, but I honestly, I don't know if this was like males trying to look cool with their tusks, or defense, or just maybe it's an evolution situation where it wasn't broke, so they didn't fix it. I'm not sure. It's a really good question. Oh, we are looking now at a plesiosaur dangling from the ceiling. One of the more spectacular things in this hall. And plesiosaurs are a great example of those modified limbs because these were one of the groups of aquatic reptiles. So they're not within that archosaur group with dinosaurs, but they are aquatic reptiles that are often, they're often shown with the dinosaurs because they lived at similar times. Here's another plesiosaur. And as we pan over this one, I think you'll be able to see the really cool modified limbs. And you'll notice too that they have lots of neck vertebrae here. Unlike mammals, where with us, you always pretty much have 7 neck vertebrae. Even if you're a giraffe, you just have 7 really big vertebrae in your neck. Okay, so this alcove is talking about a feature that unites most of the reptiles. And so this skull that they're going to show you has 2 pairs of openings behind the eyes, so temporal openings at your temples, right? And so those 2 pairs of openings are what we see in dinosaurs, pterosaurs, crocodiles, and lizards. So this is a feature that you can use to kind of unite them. Turtles did something weird. They have no openings, no temporal openings behind their eye, but that's kind of an outlier. So here you can see really clearly those 2 temporal openings behind the orbits, most kind of upward holes that we saw there. Okay, let's see where we're going now. We are looking at some more aquatic reptiles. Oh, and there's an ichthyosaur there. So this is another group of aquatic reptiles. We have quite a number of ichthyosaur fossils on display in this hall. They're really cool. They and the other aquatic reptiles gave live birth. So instead of laying eggs, they were totally aquatic. And so they actually didn't lay hard-shelled eggs at all. Their babies were born live and started swimming right away. Over here, this is a little bit of a snake panel, and they'll show some fossils up at the top that are hypothesized to be closely related to snakes and yet still retain limbs. And so it seems like this really strong and bizarre transition to lose limbs, but we see that in a couple of different amphibian and reptile groups. So snakes, legless lizards, and Sicilian amphibians are a few examples of limb loss in tetrapods. Okay, looks like we are walking back into the middle of the hall. We're gonna cross over and look at some more reptiles, I think. So this is a mosasaur here, and I think this species is some kind of Tylosaurus. Mosasaurs were just absolutely gargantuan predators. Oh, and we're panning up to look at, I think this is, someone in the comments can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is the largest turtle species that has ever lived. That's Stupendemes. I'm not sure. Oh, okay, the largest known turtle. Okay, so I don't know if that's changed in recent years, but yeah, so Stupendemes is this massive marine turtle. So just like the sea turtles that we have today, but way bigger. There's, I think that tortoise over there is one of the most photographed things in this museum. So I think we're gonna go look at him right now. Doesn't he just look so happy to be here? So this group, the cryptodires, that's the group that includes all these living turtles and tortoises. Ooh, Brittany has a great question over here. Sea turtles, yeah, so sea turtles, they were terrestrial and became aquatic. Yeah. Okay, so we just for a second looked at the most beautiful reptile, Scutosaurus. So things in the Permian, if you look up Permian animals, I just think that they're all the goofiest, best looking tetrapods. I think it's peak evolution for tetrapods in the Permian. They all look really goofy. Okay, I see that there's a question in the chat from Betty. Betty wants to know how we can tell from fossils whether they had eggs or live babies. That's an awesome question. So Betty, some fossils are preserved with embryos growing inside, particularly some of those ichthyosaur fossils. And they're actually specialists who work just on the eggs and babies of dinosaurs and other extinct groups. We just, sorry, real quick, panned across a turtle shell, and I want to point out a cool comparative anatomy thing. Turtles are really weird because their shells ultimately rest on really expanded ribs. And so, to my knowledge, they're the only group of tetrapods for which their shoulder blades are inside their ribs. Can you imagine if our skeleton was like that? Like our shoulder blades are inside of our ribs. I don't know. I think about that a lot when I think about turtles. Okay, so we're panning over Tylosaurus again. And these mosasaurs, to get back to Betty's question, this is another example of something that likely was giving live birth. And so there are hypotheses kind of one way or the other. And then we don't know for sure until you actually find embryos in those fossils. And so, okay, so let's see. Amanda wants to know, what is the biggest vertebrate? And so the biggest vertebrate is right now the blue whale. We also, there's a blue whale downstairs in the museum. And then, of course, for extinct stuff, we have giant things like the titanosaur. So sadly, sharks are not the biggest vertebrate. Wish they were. Oh, so we're panning across a Rauisuchian there. So those are relatives of crocodiles and alligators. But you can see kind of that they have this very different stance. So their legs were underneath their bodies much more than kind of the way crocodiles and alligators walk. now. So just imagine like a crocodile that was pretty big and could run like a dog. So that's scary. And so they went extinct, I think, towards the end of the Triassic, which is interesting because dinosaurs really diversified after that point. So maybe it would have been Rasukians that diversified, but instead they went extinct. Oh, and then here's our last really modified group of tetrapods. These are the pterosaurs. And pterosaurs were the earliest group of vertebrates to evolve powered flight. Okay, and so they have these beautiful, very elongate fourth digits that stretched out to form attachment for their membranous wings. And so pterosaurs have an incredible array of diversity. There was an exhibit at the museum when I was a grad student about them. And some were really tiny. I'm talking like songbird tiny. And then some, like that wing you just saw up at the ceiling, were absolutely gargantuan, like Quetzalcoatlus. They also had a lot of cool kind of ornamentation. So they had, I'm not really sure how, they're basically modified feathers. And we don't really know as much about pterosaur color compared to like the information we have about dinosaur color. But we do know that they had all of these pretty ornamentation. Marian, I am assuming that you are asking whether pterosaurs eat plants or meat. And I'm not really sure how many herbivorous or omnivorous pterosaurs there were. A lot of them were carnivorous or piscivorous. They eat fish or insects. Yeah. And that's something that, I mean, because we're in the Hall of Vertebrate Origins, there aren't a lot of diagrams and stuff of what invertebrates, these many vertebrates, were eating, but a lot of them were probably insectivores, ate insects. So insects and fishes, piscivores, yeah. So it looks like we are sort of heading back towards the start of the hall. If folks have any last minute questions, we can definitely catch those. This, I will say, I mean, it was so cool to be a student and walk through here at the museum every day. I wish we could have just spent this entire time looking at fossil sharks. Maybe that's something for another time. But I hope that you enjoyed seeing all of these specimens. Ooh, Veronica, that's a really good question. Birds came a little bit later. Yes. Cool. Yes. So birds arose later on from a group of dinosaurs called theropods. And there's probably actually a virtual tour of that hall as well. So thank you all so much for joining us. This hopefully was a nice way to spend a little bit of your day. And I just really thank you for participating and for all of your great questions. Thanks.